My name is Wes Widner. I'm from McAfee, Global Threat Intelligence, and most recently with Norse. If you're looking for some good laws, go Google Norse. Lots of fun stories there. So while at Norse, I was tasked with setting up a malware pipeline. And that's where all of this talk comes from. It's basically a presentation I wish I had given to myself before I started on this project. There was a lot of lessons learned and a lot of wrong avenues to go down. So first off, I need to talk about what a pipeline is. Some of you may be familiar with pipelining instructions through a CPU. Simply put, a pipeline is just an operation on a set of objects in order to produce some sort of outcome. But what's a malware pipeline? Malware pipeline is taking malware, as you might imagine, as the raw feed coming in, and coming up with intelligence based off of that malware. Now, we'll get into what that really means later, what type of intelligence to bring out. But another key thing to keep in mind is that the malware doesn't want to be analyzed. Most people don't realize it, but malware actually has a natural enemy, that is the automated researcher who will go through and just download a buttload of malware, try to pull it apart, and then pick out interesting bits from it. So, malware routinely employs what would be their version of an antivirus or an anti-hunting stuff. And we'll talk about the unique challenges that poses at every step of the pipeline. So, at McAfee, Norse, now at CrowdStrike, a common theme in my career is that I've worked in the intersection of big data and threat intelligence, malicious stuff. And before I keep on going, I want to point out that pretty much everything that I'm going to reference here is malicious, so buyer beware. So intersection of big data and malware, that means that I'm trying to use tools to automatically pull in and run intelligence, run analysis on this data, but it's not just big data in the typical sense. This is data that fights back at every step of the way. So, another key point, why would you want to set up a malware pipeline? It's not just for security companies anymore. Malware pipelines are used all over the place. But here are some of the products that you can pull out of a malware pipeline. Seed data for malware researchers, like the gentleman that was just here before me, and I think the one that's going to come after me, both malware researchers. Malware pipelines help augment their efforts. Presenting relationship between threats. We're talking about different classes of threats. So file threats to IPs, domains, all of that ends up building what's called a threat map or a threat graph. So all of that stuff is related to each other. Previously, just to give you an idea of what's changed in the industry, at McAfee in the Global Threat Intelligence Department, they would track each threat as a separate category. So malicious domains over here, malicious files over here, malicious IPs over here. But the problem is a threat is really a combination of these different utilities. So it would be helpful to show people the connection. And that's actually one of the things that Norse was known for, was the map where we combined some of that data. So third point here, or third product of a malware pipeline, is providing data to train predictive models. There is an enormous amount of malware that is out there, but there's not a whole lot of new malware. How many of you have ever played around with a malware building application like Meterpreter, or there used to be something way back when I was in middle school of a malware lab where you could just point and click, I want this capability and this capability, and it would actually go and build the .com file or the .exe. Those types of tools make it easy to generate a brand new piece of malware, brand new meaning that it has a new hash. So we need a better way to detect malware, not just hash-based. In fact, many people realized several years ago that hash-based analysis is pretty much broken, it's dying, and it's never going to come back. So, predictive models. Along with that, generating rules for automated protection systems like Yara rules or snort rules. Someone asked in the last session about Yara rules, generating Yara rules to find ransomware. There's different ways to generate Yara rules. The most basic would be if you see this hash, then it's bad. That's pretty much, it would be one of the fastest, but also not one of the most expansive. So generating better rules is what we're here, or is what we're looking for with Malware Pipeline. What we'd like to do is say, here's a bunch of different characteristics that these files display, and if they show these characteristics, block it. And we can only do that with a large sample set. So another product of a malware pipeline is to build better malware. Some clients really just don't want to blue team or block malware. They would like to peek over the fence and see what others have been doing, how they've been hiding from different detection systems, and use that to build better malware. And the final one is just for lulz and profit. It's actually kind of fun to go through and play with malware. We saw a video presentation of malware taking over a system. That stuff is kind of fun. And I'll tell you about some of my exploits in that in just a little bit. Oh, and this is a smaller sample size of people, so if you have any questions, feel free to throw them out at me. I don't want it to just be a information dump. But if there's no questions, then I'm just going to keep on cruising. So, who uses malware pipelines? I was asking earlier about the security community around here and what it looks like, because most communities have a different flavor. For example, Huntsville tends to be more aerospace, and Augusta tends to be more, that's where the cybersecurity headquarters of the nation is kind of moving. So malware pipelines, though, are used all over the place. In, well, of course, by InfoSec companies, by big box retail giants, banks, airlines, and manufacturers. Everybody has their own malware pipeline these days, for a good reason, too. If you really want to protect your users, one of the best things you can do as a security team is to stand up one or more computers that no one is going to actually use for work, but they're basically honeypots in your network. They mimic what a user would have. So if you're getting a whole bunch of emails that are coming in that look suspicious, have a clean system set up that you can open those on and see if they are malicious. And I guess I'm supposed to add the obligatory firewall that system off and all that other good stuff. Otherwise, you could shoot yourself in the foot. Yes? Exactly. So, this talk used to have 3 different sections: sources, mining, and I would go into the data mining part. But I realized that the data mining part actually stretched it way too far, so I supplemented that with more hands-on how to do this stuff. So now we're just going to do sources and feature generation out of those sources. But if you want to know about the data mining portion, email me afterwards and I'll give you some more information on that. So to start with, sources. I guess my daughter's pretty much learned that if she comes upon a Minecraft mod and it looks suspicious, I've drilled it into her. Take her computer to Dad. Dad will be ecstatically happy that there's more malware for me. Whenever somebody sends whenever I get something like this, an email, which I haven't looked at. Oh, maybe I don't have it on this computer. Nope. So anyway, whenever I get a malicious Word document or PDF or something like that, I'll stash those to the side and look at those later. But even though we stumble upon malware, setting up a pipeline is actually not that easy. You can find 1 or 2 pieces of malware pretty simply. But what we're looking for here is a flood of malware. So there's basically two general or broad areas of where to find malware. The most important, or the one that, if you're in the threat intelligence business, the one that everybody wants is the organic malware. These are live malicious links. These are the malware in the wild, actively malicious. Now the problem with that is malware has a half-life of less than 24 hours, especially URLs, because sites like AWS and Rackspace and all these hosting sites, they're very quick to take these links down. Because of that, malware has gotten highly automated. One of the automated things that malware uses a lot of is called domain-generated algorithms. A malware author will register 100 or so domain names, and then their malware will be set up in such a way that it will generate one of those domain names to reach out to. And so they basically have their own ad hoc network that they've set up. So they count on being taken down very quickly. As someone who wants to go find that, I have to keep that in mind, because what that looks like is if I'm running an automated script to go pull malware, first I'm going to have to find lists of malware to go find. And I actually have a handout that accompanies this talk that has several different free lists that you can use if you want. But one thing about these lists are you're going to have a very low yield of actual bad malware that comes from, that you're able to download. Number one, just because of this, the hosts get taken down so fast. The second thing is a lot of these links are set up to not actually give you the payload of malware unless you prove that you're a user, that you're a gullible user. Because of that, we need to set up what are called either honeypots or honey clients. A honeypot is just think of it as a computer that signals that it's really vulnerable and you can come and do bad things to it. Or a honey client is the same thing but with a browser. And there are 2 free utilities I want to point out here along those lines. In the talk, I don't know if the description pointed out that I was going to use some Docker examples. Was that in the description? It doesn't matter. Yeah, I think I pointed that out in the description. But anyway, one of the cool things about this, and I have a slide on this a little bit later, a lot of these security tools are freely available from Docker as a full, complete system. So the first one that I'll point out is Maltrieve. So Maltrieve is a utility that has all kinds of free malware sources, and these are organic. And for those of you taking notes, I'll have a handout that I'll send you a little bit. I guess their network here is not going to allow me to pull down malware. That's kind of sad. But at any rate, this utility will go out, pull from these lists of free malware sources, and then go try to download those pieces of malware. I think I'm competing with others for wireless space too. But thankfully, I travel with an entire hard drive of malware, just because it makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. So Maltrieve will go out and it will pull down malware, usually in, we'll get into that in just a second. The other utility is called Thug. Thug is a honey client. It mimics vulnerable browsers. So there was the Dyer, the D-Y-R-E, how do you pronounce that? I've only seen it in text. You don't know? Do what? Dried it, yeah. That flavor of malware, there was at least one strain that wouldn't download unless it detected several features in the browser. Like one very obvious one, the browser had to have a view window of greater than 0 by 0 pixels, because headless browsers, that's what they report. And that's pretty easy for the malware author to say, it's probably a spider and I'm not going to give you the payload. So, other places to look for organic sources, PCAPs, I didn't put it on here, but spam. If you're a network admin, you can probably pull these out off of your network pretty easily. Word on honey clients. Like I said, malware is big business. Hundreds of millions of dollars for these ransomware and other types of malware. And zero-day exploits are really expensive to get off of the darknet. Because of that, they're not going to give these up really easily. So that's why we have honey clients, and there's actually several different flavors of honey clients, and that's a hot area of research. Exploits cost money, especially zero-day exploits, and malware plays hard to get. Not only do they want to know that you're a viable user, but part of that being a viable user is having the right operating system, having the right behavior. A lot of malware now will actually have you go through several steps to show that you're interacting with the website or interacting with the malware in some way. So the second type of source is a synthetic source. Synthetic is a feed of malware that somebody has put together, some vendor has put together, and they will give you. And this is what they've seen. It's usually because they've put together their own honey client or honeypots or some other honey network. And there's a lot of them that are free. In fact, if you ask really nicely to a lot of these companies, they'll give you a researcher feed, especially if you tell them, if you promise and pinky swear that you're not going to resell it to someone else. And there's also been initiatives from the White House to kind of put together an official malware feed that any researcher can look at. One of the best, though, is virusshare.com. It's a Georgia Tech initiative. They offer virusshare.com. You have to ask them really nicely. Yay, I did save that password. All right, if you ask them really nicely, they'll give you a login to it. It's not, they don't charge for it. But you see the size of some of these files. These are huge roll-ups, 33, 37 gigs. I think it's basically 7 terabytes of malware here. Do what? Yeah. Yeah, these are huge. So, and lately, in the last few months, they've started doing multiple drops per month to kind of break up that huge file size. So this is honestly the bread and butter of where I pull most of my malware samples. Well, and a certain vendor that has an affinity for me. So if you're just looking for a specific piece of malware, if you're looking for Drider or ransomware or something like that, you can pull down their MD5 list and just search through that and find just the pieces, or find which dump that those pieces of malware are in. That way you're not just blindly pulling down a huge roll-up of malware. So one thing about synthetic is that you're going to get a lot of malware. And usually vendors aren't particular about selling you, this is just Windows malware, or this is just ransomware, or something like that. They're usually just a feed of malware, and then you have to filter it yourself. The 2 points to note on synthetic malware feeds: you need to pay attention to quality and overlap. So what we did was we would pull down VirusShare, and then we would measure every other vendor against VirusShare and see how much of a delta difference they have against VirusShare. Another one to use is VirusTotal. VirusTotal is a online service to look up hashes and information about malware. It's run by Microsoft, I believe. That's where Windows Defender dumps all of their hashes. And a lot of other places dump into there as well. So we'll get into that in just a second of information to pull off of malware. Yes? Google? Okay. I thought they were owned by Microsoft. Huh. Well, I guess that would explain why they're on Google App Engine then. At any rate, synthetic feeds are also usually enriched with data that the vendor has provided about the malware. Usually things like what they think the malware family is. Some of the better ones will try to tell you what cluster they've put it in. So, like I said earlier, there's a lot of similar malware. So fingerprinting the malware, we'll get into in just a second, is a hot area right now. The last part about synthetics is they're usually really smooth. So you're not going to have a whole lot of hiccups downloading it from these vendors, as opposed to having to beat up the organic sources just to get them to give you 1 out of 1,000 pieces of malware that you try to download. So with that, quality control. For organic, you want to know what the yield is, the yield being the percentage of URLs that you get, the raw feed, divided by the valid binaries that you get. And also controlling for duplicates, because some URL feed vendors who aren't paying attention or just want to inflate their numbers, they'll give you a huge feed, but it turns out that most of them are all pointing to the same piece of malware. One guy actually yelled at us while I was at Norse that his site ended up in 100 different places because he had one compromised link on his WordPress site, and every link pointed back to that. So it just came up in the reports that this guy had huge treasure trove of malware on his site. And it was funny because we weren't the only spider. There's actually friends of mine who did a research project, BSidesDC is their talk for it, where they crafted a piece of malware and put it out on DeVirus Total just to see how many other security vendors would go and get that, kind of like a cuckoo for security vendors. What they found out is that, like I said earlier, we're not the only ones that are running a malware pipeline. There's a ton of people that are running malware pipelines. So, valid binaries, and then the diversity of domains. You find a lot of overlap there. Synthetic, what's their volume look like, and is it reliable? There's a lot of one-off shops that show up, and they say, we've got this feed of malware, and they really just have 1 or 2 dumps of malware, and that's it. It's not a feed, it's just a dump. Now, a lot of the security vendors are good enough to say, this is just a roll-up, it's not a feed that you can look at forevermore. And others, they kind of go stale. So another part of synthetic, like I said, do they provide additional intelligence? Like the malware family name, and the key is whether or not they try to fingerprint the file. So that's it for sources. Anybody have any questions about sources? Where to go get malware? Lots of malware. Just using that, well, using the free sources, and we did have some vendors that fed us, that was what accounted for the terabytes of malware that we were able to amass. Fun stuff. So, refining the data. Getting all of that data in is one thing, but refining it is what we're all after. That's the intelligence in the threat intelligence business. This is where I slid the Docker stuff in. How many of you have ever worked with Docker before? Yeah? Awesome. So, why did I put Docker in here? Was it just to add another buzzword to my presentation? Yes, but that's not all. It's also in there because Docker helps make things nicer. So, if you have ever tried to set up a project called Cuckoo, you will appreciate this, that it's all wrapped up and cleanly available into a Docker package. That's important because setting up Cuckoo is a pain in the ass by itself. There's a lot of other good stuff to do to spend your time on, not setting up Cuckoo. Same goes for a lot of these security tools. They're really great, and the security researcher who puts it together, bless their heart, it works with the specific libraries that they put it together. Usually security researchers aren't the most diligent about good software building techniques. So anyway, a lot of these security tools are available as Docker images. That also has the side benefit of making it easily deployable in any sort of pipeline scenario that you want to put together. That means that your pipeline scenario, if you build it off of these Docker tools, is horizontally scalable. So that's great, especially as we've got tons of malware to analyze. So when we go to analyze malware, there's roughly three different categories from an automation perspective. The first one is the very quick surface analysis. We were talking about YARA rules earlier about matching hashes. That would be what this is, just a quick hash lookup or bytes in a certain order, specifically the magic bytes. When you run file over a file, that's looking at the magic bytes. So running file over all the files that I've downloaded here, and this was from a previous download attempt, so it's a little bit old by now. But you can see that there's a mix of PE32 and HTML files in here. Does anybody know why there's so many HTML files in this malware feed? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, emails, malicious links, yeah. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah, when we set up the malware pipeline initially, the question we had to come up with was, are we going to log error pages from the server? Because they could be just valid 404 pages, like you're saying. They could also be the malware author's attempt to trick the firewall into not caching that page and regenerating the page every time. So your mileage may vary. We chose to capture everything. So we also get a bunch of things like this. Does anybody know why this XML file is in here? Macro or Windows Internet Explorer had older versions still have this bug in it, where the XML parser would allow a buffer overflow and you could exploit it that way. So what you're getting from organic sources is also going to be mostly exploits. The gentleman came up here previously, talked about first stage, second stage, third stage of malware infection. The first stage is usually the exploit. It's finding a hole in some application, something that they can get through to. That would be PDF or Word documents or something in the browser itself, just some way that they can execute their own, it's called shellcode. The shellcode then will reach out, it's a very small tailored piece of code, it'll reach out and grab what's known as a dropper. The dropper's job is to go and get a bigger payload and put it in place. The dropper then, that bigger payload that it gets is usually the advanced persistent threat. That's the full payload of the malicious file. So usually, if you're doing an automated pipeline, you kind of want to break down what you're getting into those three categories as well. In that respect, most of these HTML files and the XML files are going to be the dropper first stage. The PE32s, probably going to be the later stage malware. And also, I want to point out that the PE32s are not all created equal. You have all kinds of different variations within the PE32s, and we'll get into that in just a second. The another one that you run into, the archives, the zip files that we saw, and so there's Java. So along the counts of malware, PE32 reigns supreme. That is the Windows executable, packed executables. Right next to it and way down the ladder is Java executable or jar files. And then way down from that would be exotic things like Linux or Mac or I think out of our entire library we had 3 malicious iOS files, mostly because it's so hard to get that to run. So the vast majority of your pipeline is going to be working with probably PE32. Unless, I mean, I started to stand up a pipeline just for Mac malware. It's the biggest thing is filtering out all of the PE32. And what you're left with is maybe 300 a year or something. This year it's supposed to double or quadruple, which would be a grand, 2,000 or so. Not a whole lot. So surface scan, very quick. The idea here is an order of one operation. So those of you who are familiar with the Big O notation, this is very important in big data because in our series of analysis, we need to go from very fast to the slower. So with our surface analysis, we're looking at bit locations, SHA-1 values, things like that. And it's in this surface analysis that we'll also probably send these hashes out to something like VirusTotal and ask them, have you seen this file? I think VirusTotal is rate limited for the average user to, 10,000 a day or something? So, what? 4 what? Just 4? Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, if you pay them a good chunk of money, then they'll up it. But if you're asking them the same questions over and over again, then they send you a nasty email and you have to fix that and all that kinds of stuff. So another key here is no dependencies. That is, this is not the place to do debugging or anything else. And what we're trying to do is filter out. If we can with confidence say this is something that everybody's seen, then we don't need to go into it. Malware stays out in the wild for a really, really long time, long past the active campaign. You'll see echoes of campaigns that are just shared around. It's kind of like the celebrities that keep dying every year because they haven't been heard from. Similar thing happens with malware. People just share it around all the time. Even if the command and control servers that service that malware are no longer in existence. So the second step, once you've found something that looks like it's unknown or reasonably interesting, would be a static analysis. A lot of malware is packed or compressed, or self-executable files are also packed. So malware tries to encrypt itself and hide itself. Like I said, it fights you at every step of the way, and this is the next real place where it fights you. There's a lot of malware authors who will intentionally add in tricks for a debugger to try to throw it off. And if you really want to get into reverse engineering malware at the byte level, opensecurity.com is a great place to start. They have really good courses for malware analysis. One of the things that they'll point out is these like Immunity Debugger or IDA Pro, they try to map out the sections of code for you automatically. Well, malware authors, they know what you're after. And so they're going to put code in there to try to trick the debugger and try to break the debugger. So there's a wonderful cat and mouse game. There's also, I noticed a really, I think they're going to give out some of these goodies down here in the bottom. But I'll go ahead and point this out. This is a really great book on that. So, Black Hat Python by Justin Seitz. That's building a debugger in Python and running that. So a programmatic debugging, which is great when you're setting up a pipeline. You can set up breakpoints. You can also do a lot of the stuff that you would do in manual analysis. There's a lot of companies that specialize in unpackers. So there was one recent malware campaign that was using the Nullsoft installation package. Does anybody know what Nullsoft is also used for? Any other application? It is an installer. But what do you know what software package that it's used to install? No? Winamp. Winamp is one of the ones that started that. Also used, I believe, for VLC as well. It's an open source installation utility. But installers, they generate, usually you'll see MSI packages. They have a bunch of other files packed into it. And that's an unpacker. So malware authors, sometimes they'll use something like a nullsoft installer, but more often than not, they'll make their own package system. And it's not because theirs is more compact or anything else. It's because, again, they're trying to hide from the automated detection. So there's a whole range of vendors who will sell just unpacking utilities. And they pride themselves on the number of unpackers that they can support. So there's also some free ones, but that's where you get in the difference between free and professional, is the number of options the professional ones support. So some other static operations, checksums in the malware. Organic checksums are usually going to, well, there's a couple of reasons why the checksums are important. One is if the checksum is invalid in the PE, that is the header of the PE, if the checksum is invalid, then it will give an invalid memory layout for the file. And that would be really easy for the malware author to write something to jump around in the file. So that's one reason that checksums could be invalid. Another reason that checksums could be invalid is that a lot of the big feeds of malware, they pull not just from malware that's on disk, but malware that's in memory. And if the malware is in memory as it's being run, and something like an antivirus program grabs a snapshot of it and pulls it up to the cloud, then the memory locations are not going to match up with what the file has reported it as, especially if they're doing process hollowing, which is a good process starts up, and then the malware just takes over that process. And then an antivirus program or something like that, I know that Windows Defender does this to some degree, takes a snapshot of it, puts it up online. Now the header will be wrong there, and that's important because if you're doing automated analysis, you can't assume, if the header is invalid, you can't assume that you could just walk the file like it would be a normal file to debug. You have to kind of guard against that. That has programmatic debugging implications. The last two on here, generate an abstract syntax tree, AST. That's what, if you've ever used a debugging program like OllyDebug or Immunity or IDA Pro, when they first load the file, you have this wonderful tree of execution. That tree of execution is the abstract syntax tree. So a lot of malware will try to short circuit itself if it sees anything that's out of the ordinary. So out of the ordinary used to just mean if it's running in a virtual machine. There was a time when malware just would not run on a virtual machine. There was a well-known trick called the red pill that malware authors would incorporate. It's just a few bytes, and all it does is it would check to see if it was running on VMware or really just VMware. I mean, they had some checks for VirtualBox as well, but that wasn't as prolific. So companies like McAfee would try to run a whole bank of systems running in VMware, and just like this, they would run their pipeline. So malware authors would, in the abstract syntax tree, what it would look like is one block, check, see if it's virtual machine, and then quit execution. Well, in a pipeline, what you'd probably want to do is this other point up here, patch the execution flow. So it's a type of fuzzing. Fuzzing, to get into that a little bit, is usually when you think of fuzzing, you think of finding holes in software that you could exploit, that you could use from a red team perspective and inject code into. From a malware pipeline perspective, I fuzz the malware to see, I want it to run to completion because I want to see everything that it does. So from a static analysis perspective, I want to see all the way down through reaching out to the command and control servers. If you look at it as, if you gamify it, the whole process of malware analysis, finding the C2 servers is the jackpot. Because if we can find that, then we can shut down the central, the points that control the malware, and the rest of it kind of dries up. So there's other things that are interesting to mine out of malware as well, but that's one of the biggest ones. Opcodes. There's certain opcodes that malware uses that most normal software won't use. So, for exploits, it would probably be a NOP sled, something like that. So, and the opcodes and combination of opcodes is one of the things that machine learning is used for. You take the file, you pull out the opcodes, and you have a whole bunch of opcodes listed. So for every one of these files, especially for the PE32s, we'd pull out all of the opcodes, and then we would compare those opcodes. And then there's a pattern that would emerge from the opcodes. Now, this also requires you to have a really good control list to train your algorithms and things like that. But just suffice to say, static analysis, one thing to pull out of it is opcodes. And the last one, the last type of analysis for malware, and arguably the sexiest, is the dynamic analysis. This is where I mentioned Cuckoo earlier. Before I get to static, I meant to show a few more of these. So I kind of went off the rails. So Radar and PE Scanner are two static analysis tools to use with Docker. So Radar is a programmatic debugging suite, and PE Scanner is something that you could use to pull out header information, things like that. The other static bits of data. So dynamic analysis, I mentioned Cuckoo earlier. Cuckoo is an open-sourced dynamic analysis platform. Cuckoo works by, the general idea is you have a virtual machine that has a snapshot to a clean state. You inject malware into that virtual machine, you run it, and you wait and see what it does. And then when you're done, you reset it back to the clean snapshot state and do it all over again. That's basically what you're doing with dynamic analysis. The problem, though, the trick is, one, getting the malware to run. Malware is actually tailor-made to certain operating systems. In order to make the malware smaller and leave less of a footprint, malware authors will make a lot of assumptions about where they're running. They'll assume that certain DLLs are available. So you'll probably notice, you've probably seen this, a user gets infected and you see a bunch of errors that pop up about MVC40.dll or something. The malware author is assuming that that file is available for them to use. And it doesn't really matter in their minds whether it crashes on 40% of systems. It's just got to run on a few of those in order for them to infect and own that machine. As someone who's putting up a pipeline, the interesting bit for me is I need to have a variety of machines running. And so I also need to kind of tailor which piece of malware I'm going to run in which machine. So if I'm looking at the PE header file, I need to match like the .NET version that it was compiled against with the machine that I'm going to run it on. Otherwise, going back to virus share, if you'll notice, the files here start in 2012. The files in that archive in 2012, a lot of those are going to target XP or younger systems. So they're not going, you end up patching the virus out if you're running it on 2003 or 8 or 12. So you have to match the system to the virus. Unfortunately, virus authors aren't going to help you with that by letting you know. But like I said earlier, if you're setting this up for your environment, if you're protecting a network, then you would usually in a dynamic environment just want to set up the machines that are behind your firewall, the ones that you know about. I don't know what the school here runs, but say that they run Windows 7 or so. Then set up a bunch of Windows 7 machines with varying different installation packages, like different versions of Office that might be run inside the organization, PDF viewers, stuff like that. Anything that doesn't run on those systems, you can safely ignore. As a pipeline architect, I also want to turn off as many patches as possible. I want to give the malware enough chance to run. So it's another tip that I learned. Don't go through and do the updates like you normally would. Otherwise, you get kind of frustrated because none of the malware's running. So a key with dynamic analysis is the hypervisor. So the hypervisor is VMware or VirtualBox or QEMU. The hypervisor is what runs the system that's on top of it. Along those lines, there's also ZeroWine. ZeroWine is a utility for running malware in a wine type environment. Now, ZeroWine unfortunately hasn't been updated in quite a while. They also use QEMU. So the point is, everything with malware analysis comes down to the hypervisor. If I'm injecting malware into my Cuckoo sandbox and I'm waiting for it to do something, then what's the easiest way for a malware author to evade my detection? Do what? Wait. Yeah. We were talking about it earlier. Malware will just wait for a couple of days or so before it executes. It's nothing to them, but it aggravates the fool out of me. So if I own the hypervisor for the system, and I guess another good way to demonstrate this with a slide background would be Inception. If I own the environment, then I can tell you all kinds of crazy stuff. For example, I can start the execution of the malware and then speed up the system clock and kind of warp it into the future. That way, you think that you're, a year or so in the future and I need to execute now or something like that. Combine that with fuzzing earlier, great stuff. So another factor in dynamic analysis with these environments, you're probably not going to have a good time if your malware can't get out to the internet. A lot of malware, first thing it does is it issues a ping to see if it's in a sane environment. So I've had friends that have put together malware sandboxes in an air-gapped environment. That is, no connection to the outside world. Well, unless it's malware that's specifically targeting, like programmable logic chips, something like that, like Stuxnet, it's not going to run. It's just going to try to reach out to the internet, not find anything, and assume that there's nothing it can do. The days of malware just being a nuisance or just wreaking havoc on a system without any further goal are pretty much gone. So malware now has a purpose. So it's going to try to reach out and do, it's going to make sure that it can get to its, and it's not reaching directly out to its command and control servers. It's reaching out to, I forget what you call that tier of proxy servers, kind of the ones that mask the C2 servers. It's going to try to reach out to one of those. So, now that we've got those two basic pieces, now what do we do with the pipeline? Well, we can feed it back into itself. Malware usually begets malware. So you end up with this blooming problem where if you let it run for long enough, it will go find more. Like I said, droppers, that's what they do. It was mentioned in the last session that someone asked about a zip that contained 3 different pieces of malware. Well, malware authors aren't dumb. They know that they get, there's power in numbers. So one of those files you're going to click on and one of those exploit mechanisms is probably going to work. So all 3 of those represent a new piece of malware for us to put through the system and see what it does. Chances are they all go to the same C2 server. And if we know that they came in the same package, we can kind of associate them together and say this was used as part of a set. One key thing with a malware pipeline and threat intelligence in general is to cut out the noise. There's an awful lot of noise. And just by noise, I mean in a cuckoo installation, you're going to see a ton of requests out to Microsoft. Every time the system runs, it's going to call, it's going to phone home. That's just a background bit of noise. There's a whole bunch of other tools that phone home for no good reason. We were talking about it earlier. My TV phones home. Don't know why. So because of that, we need to establish baselines. This will also help in your organization too, to say, this is what a clean system looks like, and this is what it does, just left by itself. It's not malicious, it just does that. A good example would be a friend of mine emailed me a while back and asked what 1e100.com, what that domain was, and if she was infected. Anybody know what that domain is? Yeah, Google. It's one of Google's back-end services. And the interesting thing is if you run it through Whois, it's what is it, Mark Monitor? Yeah, it's Mark Monitor, registered to Mark Monitor. So unless you knew the baseline, you wouldn't, that does kind of look suspicious because it kind of looks to the untrained eye like a domain-generated algorithm. Domain-generated algorithms have a whole lot of randomness in them, but most people don't really know that. So with that, I give you the link to the handout, which has a lot more of the sources plus all of the utilities that I mentioned here. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to ask now or tweet or email me later. So with that, I'll open it up and ask questions. I know that the next speaker is probably ready to come up here, itching to come up here, right? You don't know? Okay. Yeah. All right.
Any questions?
Any questions? Yeah.
So what tools are you using to do some of the static analysis? Are any big parts of your chain that you're doing with the static? Or what specific tools are you using? I saw Mastiff up on your screen.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else specific that you're using, or is it all just kind of your own pipeline that you build up a hodgepodge of tools?
So, yeah, the question is the specific tools I use for static analysis. And I rated your goodie box up here and found one of the books. I assume that you're going to give this away.
That's correct.
I would love it if you could give this book away during this talk because this is actually really related to what you were asking.
And you can give it away.
I will try to think of a challenge in just a second. So along those lines to your question, there are an awful lot of Python-based tools. So PE-info or PE-file or PE-frame, PE-info, there's just a ton of Python utilities. And I think Justin points out in this book that there's a lot of libraries that he uses. So programmatically, that just fits hand in hand. If we've got all these utilities that are already built, some of them like Mastiff, things like that, they're a full suite, but not a lot of those are programmer friendly. So that's the real key is it programmer friendly? IDA Pro has a way to hook into it with Python. So, and of course, if you build your own debugger, then you can have even more control. So for static analysis, we actually, version 1 of the pipeline, we scrapped in favor of re-implementing it all in Python, just because of the amount of libraries that are out there. Now, there are vendors like Reversing Labs, and you're going to pay these guys a buttload of money because they're good at what they do. But there are vendors that will help you. They will sell you static analysis tools. Now, these guys specialize in unpackers. That's all they talk about. They get kind of annoying about it, but they are pretty decent about that. So Yeah, we use a mixture of free and paid.
Commercial attackers, reversing labs is obviously one of them. Are there any other that, maybe aren't free but aren't like extremely expensive, or is it, goes from free or expensive?
Yeah, from what I've seen, it's either free or it is just, oh my God, where did you come up with that number? We actually had that with vendors as well. So one of the things that I did for the organic URLs is I would actually price it per URL. And there was one vendor that came out to like $200 a URL when everybody else was running like 50 cents or so. And we had to go back to them. That was a weird conversation. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was curious, so on building the pipeline, you get the attachments or the URLs. Chasing the URLs seems like a bit more work, and I'm curious if you had
Oh, yeah.
any perspective relative to the low-hanging fruit, attachments versus URLs, and any variance in discoveries in the two deliveries.
Yeah, actually, your discovery and where you go with the pipeline is radically different based on which one you're ingesting. So if it's just the PE files, then you're going to be in PE land, debugging or disassembling Windows files and doing all that stuff. But if you're pulling organic URLs, there's an interesting thing that happens there. You're actually following the links online, and you end up building a Google of malware, spidering out their infrastructure. And what you find is you may start with an HTML that points to an XML, and in the XML it has a CData payload that you have to undo. It's very similar to the capture the flag stuff. So you have to follow, and each, the pipeline has to be built in such a way that, oh, I found this file and it had this blob of data, I need to reverse that and go into it. So, and for non-threat intelligence companies, for most of these others that I've showed you, like the big box retailers, all they care about is an attachment to an email. So if it's not that, and plus they can control the firewall a little bit better, they can just say, we're going to block all of these other domains. And usually they have other security vendors in front of them that they can leverage as well. So yeah, it really depends. What you ingest depends on, or that determines where you're going to go afterwards. Yeah. So it's not just a pipeline. It ends up being a malware graph. So it goes from this node to this. Every piece of it ends up being really interesting. All right. All right. Well, thank you guys.